So, what makes me cranky about Bill and Ted Face the Music?
Well, dude, contrary to what most of the marketing would have you believe, it's not a Bill and Ted sequel so much as a soft all-female reboot of Bill and Ted.
I say soft because unlike straight gender swaps a la Ghostbusters 2016, Bill and Ted do at least get to be more than glorified cameos in their own franchise. Clearly, somebody must have done the math on how hard all those movies have bombed and realized they kind of needed Keanu Reeves and Alex Winters if they wanted to get anyone to come see this thing. So our two lovable dopes do at least get about half the screen time here, as they hop through time and space looking for the versions of themselves that have already written the song that's supposed to unite the world. As you may recall, that's why George Carlin showed up to help them in the first movie, as failing high school would have prevented them from forming the Wild Stallions and playing the song that saves humanity in the future. Now that they've spent 2 decades trying and failing to figure it out, time's pretty much up, and so they figure they'll take a time travel shortcut just like they did in high school, only to discover it makes things way worse for themselves. It's a pretty interesting starting point, and in a perfect world it would have become a strange sort of parable for reaching middle age and coming to terms with all the things you planned to do but didn't, and perhaps learning that there's always still time to do things better. Or maybe it would just be a funny reversal showing that you might be able to get away with taking shortcuts as high school kids, but it doesn't work out quite so well as adults. Unfortunately, Bill and Ted are old white guys now, and we still need to balance the cosmic scales of social justice, so they can't really be the heroes of their own story. Instead, that job falls to their daughters, Billy and Thea, who coincidentally sound exactly like their fathers, even though that makes no sense whatsoever given how incredibly out of date that way of talking is. Sure, I can buy the girls following in their father's footsteps to become the music-obsessed slackers that they are, but it's already quite a stretch that Bill and Ted still sound like high school stoners from the 90s at this point in their lives. Never mind having a pair of modern-day teenage girls running around duding and whoaing, especially when you consider the fact that their moms are 15th century princesses who have retained their English accents and diction, so one might expect that to rub off on them at least a little. Naturally, we can't have the female versions of Bill and Ted be idiots, though, or we might set women back another 20 years, so they added an additional level of cognitive dissonance by making the girls fluent in quantum mechanics, so they're always switching back and forth between stoner speak and technobabble. The parallels don't end with their names and speaking style, of course. George Carlin's character also had a daughter, and that daughter also shows up in the present to give the girls a chance to hop through time, collecting historical figures in an attempt to bail out their fathers from the jam they created by time travel in the first place. So you can see how somebody probably intended to do the full gender swap reboot thing, but ultimately didn't get their way. The problem is, the two different quests end up stepping all over each other until they finally come together in the most painfully predictable manner possible. It's so stupidly obvious from the beginning that I had to remind myself it would actually still be a spoiler to reveal it in the review. In any case, each quest feels really rushed because we don't have enough time to do both of them properly. And they even try to stuff in a third subplot on top of all of that they quietly drop halfway through when they realize they just don't have time for it. Something needed to go, and it probably should have been the reboot stuff because like most reboots, it's just a pale imitation of a better story. It lacks all of the charm and originality of Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, and the journey doesn't mean much of anything for Billy and Thea the way it did for our Wild Stallions in the first movie because their quest has very little to do with whatever flaws they may have, and doesn't really have any bearing on how things play out in the end. Bill and Ted, on the other hand, were dim-witted rocker wannabes, who essentially got a crash course in history thanks to a time-traveling stranger, which was necessary if for no other reason than it created a stable time loop for themselves and for the future of humanity. It was a silly movie, but it worked. Bill and Ted Face the Music does not. Without the charm and originality, it just comes across as dumb most of the time. Worse still, most of the humor doesn't land, and it's constantly flirting with the border between flat and outright cringeworthy. I haven't gone back to watch the original Bill and Ted or their bogus Journey sequel in a while, so that might be a function of the characters, but it just didn't work at all here. In addition, not only does it suffer from all the problems that usually come into play from a reboot and or sequel, but thanks to the time travel element, it's also technically a prequel, since it's all about the thing that creates the need for the Excellent Adventure in the first place, and thus it has all the problems inherent in prequels too. You already know what can and cannot happen in order for things to fit the timeline that's been established already, and worse still, it's about a legendary event in this universe. As we've seen in prequel after prequel, trying to flesh out something like that almost never goes well, because the details were never actually meant to be known. At best, it just fails to live up to the idea of it people have already conjured in their minds. At worst, it reveals all the ways it couldn't possibly have worked in the first place. In other words, whatever you come up with for the performance that unites all of humanity will never be as cool as the legend of it or as believable as the premise itself. This is the reason Tenacious D's song is a tribute to the greatest song in the world, and not actually billed as the greatest song in the world. Nobody would ever agree that, yeah, you wrote the greatest song in the world. So they sing about having performed it and forgotten it instead. Much like this movie has been performed and will shortly be forgotten. Thanks to all the reboot stuff, it's just not unique enough to leave a stamp on history, and the rest is simply too shortchanged to reach whatever potential it might have had. Everything else, the acting, direction, music, etc., is handled competently, so it can't even reach so bad as good territory. There's some nostalgia in seeing Bill and Ted again, but as I said, the shtick doesn't quite work the same for middle-aged Keanu and Alex as it did when they were supposed to be high schoolers. Which is why I always question why anyone would want a Bill and Ted 3 in the first place. Now, normally my ratings involve when and how you should watch a movie, but given current events, it's quite possible you still can't actually go to a theater at all. In which case, you're not really missing anything. If you can go to a theater, I can't say this is the movie I'd want to recommend you go see, but if we want theaters to survive this whole thing, they'll need a little charity, so please at least go see something at full price, even if it's this. Chances are it'll be the one time in your life you get the place almost entirely to yourself, without people on their cell phones, or crinkling wrappers, or talking through the whole thing. Anyway, that's what I thought about Bill and Ted Face the Music. It's nice to be back doing a review, and with any luck, we'll soon be getting back to doing them more routinely again, so feel free to subscribe so you know when the next one shows up. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. I have something to complain about.